My name is Alina Ward, and the day I walked into that courtroom, I swear the air itself turned against me. It smelled of varnish and victory, not mine, of course, but theirs. OmniCorp's lawyers sat in neat gray rows, their suits sharp enough to slice conscience into ribbons. Behind them, the press waited, whispering like vultures circling over something they were sure was already dead. That something was me. I was 73 years old, my back bent by years of screens and server rooms, my heart bowed by something heavier betrayal. They called me the hacker grandma on the local news, said I'd tried to sabotage the very company that had once paid my bills. They left out the part where I debuilt the core code that made OmniCorp's monitoring systems possible. They left out that I begged them to stop when I discovered what that system was being used for. When the judge's gavel struck, it sounded like the last nail in a coffin I hadn't realized was already mine. I clutched my folder, the old worn manila one with corners softened by years of trembling fingers. Inside was everything. Proof that OmniCorp's darling CEO, Mr. Sterling, had done more than steal my software. He'd twisted it into a lie that poisoned the veins of my town, Grayridge. Grayridge wasn't much to outsiders a single main street. It's a cluster of smokestacks and a river that once ran clear enough to reflect the stars. OmniCorp changed all that. Their new filtration plant promised jobs, clean water, a rebirth for the working class. People called it a miracle. My husband Tom used to say, "Finally, something good for this town, Ellie. Maybe now our grandkids will stay." He died believing that. I wish I had let him. The truth was less miraculous. Hidden deep in the plant system was my design and algorithm ID written years before to detect contaminants in real time. Sterling had turned it on its head. Instead of exposing toxins, it masked them. The system falsified purity reports, feeding the town glowing numbers while the real data-led mercury arsenic sank quietly into the archives. I remember the day I found out. It was spring, but the air tasted metallic, and the fish from the river had started to vanish. Children were getting sick, nosebleeds that wouldn't stop, rashes like fire under their skin. I knew the symptoms. I'd seen them once before. In the reports from a neighboring state, OmniCorp had helped modernize. Same pattern, same silence. So I broke into my own system, the one I built from scratch 15 years earlier. My fingers shook, not from age, but fear. Within minutes, I found it. The patch Sterling had ordered, hidden under the name WT-R Integrity Override. It wasn't a fix. It was a mask. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a single lamp burning, the hum of the refrigerator the only witness. The file blinked on my old laptop screen, a quiet digital confession. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my teeth. For a moment, I almost closed it, told myself I was wrong. After all, everyone loved OmniCorp. They built playgrounds, donated laptops to schools, sponsored the Christmas parade. Who was I, an old widow with fading eyesight, to accuse a giant? But then I saw her face. Little Maya Clarkson, 7 years old, in the hospital last winter with kidney failure. Her mother used to bring me cookies every Friday after church. I still remembered the way Maya's hair fell across her cheek as she slept, her skin pale as paper. I thought of my husband's hands, calloused from fixing the town's water pipes all those years, believing in what OmniCorp had promised. That was the moment something inside me broke open. I wasn't wrong. I was late. I printed every file I could find. My printer worked like a desperate animal, spitting out truth faster than I could stack it. When it jammed, I fed it page by page, whispering to myself like a prayer. "Not this time," I said. "You won't bury this one." For months, I tried to sound the alarm. The town council smiled politely, then quietly called Sterling's office. A week later, my job disappeared. Then my pension. Then my reputation. People crossed the street to avoid me. They said I'd gone senile. That grief had driven me into conspiracy. Even Pastor Lyle, who baptized my children, told me to let it go. "God will judge them, Alina," he said softly. "You don't have to." But God, as far as I could tell, was too busy listening to OmniCorp's charity hymns. So I gathered everything: server logs, internal memos, contamination maps, and handed them to the only man who still took my calls, Mr. Alvaro, defense lawyer who looked like he hadn't slept since the last century. His tie was always crooked, his briefcase scuffed to the bone. It's the first time I met him. He sighed so deeply I thought he might evaporate. "You're fighting a hurricane with a paper umbrella," he told me. "I built the storm," I replied. He stared at me then, long and hard, as if deciding whether to laugh or listen. To his credit, he chose the latter. Which brings us back to the courtroom, to that breathless moment when I slid the folder across the table. When he opened it, the pen dropped from his fingers like a guillotine's blade. That sound did split the air, sharp and final. The OmniCorp lawyers shifted uneasily, though they didn't know why yet. The judge adjusted his glasses. Somewhere in the back, a camera clicked, capturing the exact moment the tide began to turn. For the first time in years, I felt steady. Every humiliation, every sleepless night replaying my husband's faith in that cursed company, all of it led here. I could feel Tom's ghost beside me, not his comfort, but his witness. When the hearing adjourned, the crowd spilled into the corridor like spilled marbles, chaotic, whispering. Alvaro leaned close, his voice rough as gravel. "Alina," he said, "you understand this could bury Sterling? This isn't just civil. This is criminal." I nodded. "Then let him drown in the same water he sold us." He looked at me, eyes narrowing, as if seeing not an old woman, but a blade long forgotten in its sheath. "You're not done, are you?" "No," I said quietly. "Not until the town knows. Not until every child can drink without fear." Outside, Grayridge slept under a low, smothering sky. The river moved sluggishly, as though even it had grown weary of carrying our sins. I stood by the courthouse steps and listened to the hum of OmniCorp's trucks in the distance, the neon sign on their factory flickering like a false promise. Tomorrow, brighter. My hands trembled, but not from age. Something inside me had awakened something sharper than pain, older than justice. I realized then that revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it starts as a whisper in the dark, a truth too heavy to stay buried. I still remember the first day I walked into OmniCorp's headquarters. The building was taller than any I had seen in Grayridge, its steel and glass facade gleaming under a sun that felt almost too bright. The lobby smelled of polished floors, expensive coffee, and ambition, the kind of ambition that doesn't know it's crushing lives beneath its heels. I was 28, freshly divorced, and desperate to prove that a woman, even one from a small town like ours, could thrive in the tech world. Sterling was there that morning, shaking hands with everyone, but looking straight at me as if he could see the algorithms swirling in my mind. His smile was practiced, smooth, and yet it carried a subtle warmth that made you believe he genuinely cared. "Alina," he said, voice rich and deliberate, "you have talent we can't afford to waste." I believed him. I wanted to believe him. I threw myself into my work. Nights blurred into mornings as I built systems, tested servers, and wrote code that would later become the backbone of OmniCorp's entire monitoring network. I loved the precision of it, the way one line of code could ripple through the system. Correcting errors, predicting outcomes, safeguarding people. I thought I was doing good. I thought we were doing good. Wasn't until years later that I realized how naive I had been. Sterling never cared about the town. Not really. The projects he funded, the clean rivers he promised in brochures, the flashy health initiatives, all facades. I found out slowly, piece by piece. It started with subtle inconsistencies in data reports. A chemical reading flagged as safe that, according to my own checks, was dangerously high. Then came the whispered complaints from maintenance staff, people too afraid to speak up in meetings but desperate enough to share in private that the higher-ups would never approve the truth. I confronted him once during a quarterly review, hoping for an explanation. "Alina," he said, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled, "your data is interesting. But maybe your standards are too rigid for the real world." I remember my stomach dropping, the blood leaving my face, my fingers gripping the edge of the table. Too rigid. People are getting sick. Children, Sterling, you promised safety? He chuckled softly, a sound that still makes my skin crawl. Safety is a relative term, Alina. Numbers can comfort people, but they don't have to match reality. That was the moment I saw the man behind the mask. I'd been blind for years, enchanted by the illusion of leadership and respect. My hands shook as I left the office that day, clutching my notebook like it was a shield. But I didn't quit. I couldn't. Every fiber of my being, every memory of Tom teaching me to be meticulous and honest, kept me tethered to my work. I stayed, hoping I could find a way to protect the town from the inside. To correct his lies without destroying everything I had built, and then the layoffs came. The memo was short and sterile. OmniCorp is realigning its IT department. Your position is no longer required. I stared at the screen for hours, too numb to cry. I had devoted my life to the company, to Sterling, and this was my reward. The town, of course, saw it differently. I was let go for incompetence. Friends who had once praised my brilliance avoided me. The post office clerk, who had known me since I was a girl, offered a timid sorry about work. As if the words could erase years of dedication, I should have left it there. I should have accepted the narrative. But then the river began to change. It wasn't a sudden catastrophe. The water didn't turn black overnight, and no fish floated belly up at first. It started with subtle smells, a chemical temps in the tap water. Next came the reports from parents: rashes, nosebleeds, fatigue. I listened quietly, recording every detail, every whispered fear, every late-night hospital visit. The truth, once hidden in plain sight, became a hammer striking my ribs. I started to investigate, alone. I remember the nights I spent crouched in the shadows of the OmniCorp plant. My laptop perched precariously on my knees, watching the servers through open windows I accessed with the credentials I had built years before. The air was heavy with the scent of chlorine and machinery. Every hum of the ventilation system felt like a countdown, every flickering fluorescent light a warning. And then I found it, a hidden protocol buried under layers of system permissions. The water testing results weren't just wrong, they were intentionally falsified. A single line of code changed the readings for contaminants, ensuring the town would see safe levels even as real concentrations rose. I felt my stomach lurch. My hands trembled, not from age or fatigue, but from the sheer icy realization of betrayal. Sterling hadn't just lied to me, he had lied to the entire town, to every family that trusted him. He had taken my work, my passion, and used it to poison the people I loved. That's when I began collecting evidence, methodically, obsessively. Files, emails, memos, internal communications, anything that proved what I had suspected. Each page I saved, each folder I copied felt like an act of quiet defiance. My home became a map of corruption, a shrine of hidden truths, and somewhere in the background a small, burning hope began to take shape. I thought of Tom again. He would have wanted me to fight. He always believed in doing the right thing, even when it cost you everything. I swore, under the dim light of my kitchen, that I wouldn't let his faith or the faith of Grayridge's people be shattered. And yet, even as I gathered evidence, I felt a creeping isolation. Friends turned into strangers, colleagues into enemies, and the townspeople who once smiled at me now averted their gaze. Fear has a subtle power. It can silence a town just as effectively as a corporate threat. I became a ghost in the streets of my own home, an old woman carrying secrets too heavy for anyone else to bear. One night, exhausted, I sat on my porch and stared at the river. The water reflected the orange glow of street lamps, but beneath the surface I knew the truth. Dark currents poisoned by greed twisted unseen. I ran my fingers over the folder that contained my collected files. It was small, unassuming, yet heavier than any weight I had ever carried. It represented years of knowledge, betrayal, and now purpose. That night, I decided something that would change everything. I would take it all, the files, the memos, the hidden server logs, and I would fight. Not for recognition, not for money, but for Grayridge, for every child who had ever fallen sick because of Sterling's lies, for every family that trusted a man who had sold them deception in a shiny corporate wrapper. And so, with trembling hands but a steady heart, I began preparing for the moment that would define the rest of my life. Exposing the truth. Little did I know that the first step would lead me to a courtroom, to a man who still believed in the law, and to a confrontation. With Sterling himself, a confrontation I had imagined 1,000 times, but that now finally felt close enough to touch. I didn't yet know how the city, the company, or the people I loved would react. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Justice would not come easy, and it would not be kind. I was ready. I remember the first time I saw Sterling after I had begun collecting evidence. It wasn't in the grand, sterile boardroom where I had once admired Hammett. Was at a company gala, the kind where the champagne sparkled and the press flashed their relentless cameras. He smiled at me as if nothing had changed. That same practiced warmth that once made me trust him, the same charm that hid a darkness I now understood too well. "Alina," he said, approaching with a measured step. "It's been a while." His eyes flicked to the small stack of files I carried in my bag, and though he didn't mention them, I felt his awareness like a cold breeze brushing against my neck. I smiled politely, hiding the tremor in my hands. "It has. I've been busy." "Busy?" He laughed softly, leaning in closer than necessary. "I hope you're not meddling where you shouldn't?" I clenched my jaw, keeping my voice steady. "I've always cared about this town, Mr. Sterling. Some of us take responsibility seriously." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly, then returned his mask-like smile. "Responsibility. Sometimes it's heavier than one person can bear. Perhaps you should leave it to the experts." That night I returned home and set my files on the table. Their weight more than physical. Each document, each memo, each corrupted reading was a reminder of the cruelty hidden behind charm and eloquence. Sterling wasn't just stealing data, he was stealing lives, twisting hope into profit. I couldn't let him continue. Not for Grayridge, not for Tom, and certainly not for myself. I began working in earnest. Nights stretched into mornings. My apartment became a labyrinth of paper and glowing screens. I would cross-reference the water logs with hospital reports. Anonymized, of course, to protect privacy, but still revealing patterns. Spikes in lead, mercury, and other contaminants coinciding with critical errors in system outputs. The data formed a damning picture. Sterling's system wasn't flawed, it was deliberately engineered to fail the people who trusted him most. It wasn't just about water anymore. It was about betrayal in its purest, most intimate form. One evening, I almost lost everything. A knock at my door startled me sharp, deliberate. I froze. It was late. I didn't expect visitors. Through the peephole, I saw a young man in a uniform. He claimed to be delivering a package. The box was heavy, wrapped in plain brown paper. My instincts screamed, but curiosity and politeness got the better of me. I opened the door and the man handed me the package. There was no signature, no return address. I set it down cautiously and closed the door. Inside I found a camera, its lens trained on my apartment, and a note. "Stop digging, or everyone you love pays the price." My hands shook violently. The threat was clear, and the fear was immediate. But in that fear, something solidified. Sterling, or whoever acted in his interest, knew the truth, or at least suspected I was uncovering it. And if they knew, it meant I was closer than ever. I didn't report it to the police. In my experience, the law often bowed to the powerful. Instead, I reinforced my security, both physical and digital. Cameras, encrypted backups, dead drops for evidence. Every night, I felt like a spy in my own town, but I was no longer a victim. I was the only shield between Grayridge and a disaster it would never suspect. Weeks passed, and the town began to notice. More children fell ill. Parents whispered their suspicions, but few dared speak openly. At the grocery store, a mother avoided my eyes as she handed her child a water bottle, as if acknowledging me would acknowledge the truth, and that was dangerous. I saw it in the shopkeepers, the teachers, the nurses. Fear mixed with gratitude as if they all knew I was fighting in silence. Then came the day I confronted Sterling directly. I arranged a meeting under the guise of returning some old code I had forgotten to submit. He didn't suspect me. I could see it in the way he relaxed, the casual way he motioned for me to sit. I brought some of my old files, I said, keeping my tone light, almost apologetic. I thought you might want to archive them properly. He smiled, nodding, always thorough. That's why I trusted you. I placed a single folder on the table, then leaned closer, lowering my voice. Do you know what this is, Sterling? Do you understand what's happening in Grayridge because of your system? He froze. The practiced mask faltered. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something behind his eyes, not charm. Not arrogance, but calculation. He didn't answer immediately. I don't follow, he said carefully, choosing his words like a tightrope walker. I slammed the folder down. Don't play with me. You've poisoned the town, Mr. Sterling. Children, families, the people you promised to protect, you've lied to them. You've used me, my work, to hide it all. Silence fell. I could hear the hum of the ventilation, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights, and the thump of my own heart. Sterling's face was calm again, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew the truth. He leaned back slowly, almost theatrically, then said, Alina, you misunderstand. Everything was necessary. The town, they don't understand complexity. Sometimes we must make decisions for their own good. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. Good? Do you call poisoning children good? I worked for years, trusted you, and all this time, you hid your greed behind smiles and press releases. Sterling's jaw tightened. You don't know the whole picture? I know enough, I said firmly. And soon, everyone will know. I've backed up every file, every memo, every corrupted reading. Your lies can't survive outside your walls. And once the town sees it, it will end. He stared at me a long moment, lips pressed thin. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not the warm smile I once trusted, but the cruel, confident smile of a man who believed he had the power to intimidate anyone. You're bold, he said, but boldness can be dangerous. I stood, tucking my folder under my arm. Dangerous for the guilty, Sterling. Not for the innocent. Leaving that room, I felt a thrill unlike any I had known since Tom died. Fear still pulsed at the edges of my mind, but it was tempered by determination. I had seen him falter. I had heard the tremor in his voice when I spoke truth to him. It was proof that the walls he built around his lies could crack. Back at home, I spread out my files again, reviewing, cataloging, preparing. Every night, I imagined the courtroom the moment the truth would spill over. Unstoppable. I imagined Sterling's empire trembling like a dam under pressure. And yet, I knew the fight was far from over. OmniCorp was vast, its reach long, and Sterling had legions who would protect him. Each day, each decision became a calculation. The town was fragile, my health was not what it once was, and the threats were very real. But with every risk, every sleepless night, I felt a spark of something older than fear. Justice, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that waits patiently for the right moment to strike, and I knew that moment was approaching. The folder weighed more than I expected. It wasn't heavy in the way a book is heavy, or a bag of groceries was heavy. In the way truth is heavy, in the way a lifetime of lies can sit on your shoulders and make your spine ache. Each page carried decades of deceit, each memo a quiet scream for justice. I carried it carefully, like a fragile treasure. For weeks, I had prepared for this moment. Every line of code I had written, every email Sterling had sent, every report he had altered, all of it was here. The evidence was irrefutable. And yet I knew that having it wasn't enough. Power doesn't crumble under facts alone. Power crumbles under exposure, under humiliation, under the kind of justice that leaves no room to lie. I met Alvaro in a quiet cafe, The kind of place where the clatter of coffee cups could mask whispered conspiracies. He looked older than usual, more weary, as if carrying my folder alongside me was part of his own burden. "Are you sure about this?" Aki asked, voice low. "Once we start, there's no turning back, I'm sure," I said, placing the folder on the table between us. This town deserves the truth. Those kids deserve clean water. And we're done letting Sterling play God with our lives. Alvaro lifted the first page. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He scanned the server logs, then the memos. Every signature, every command was there. Sterling's orders to falsify water reports were explicit. My stomach tightened, waiting for his reaction. "God, Alina," he whispered finally, "if this gets out, it could. It could bring the entire company down. Criminal charges, civil suits, the works." I nodded. "I know, and it will." The problem, of course, was getting it out. OmniCorp didn't just have lawyers. They had armies of lawyers, PR teams, lobbyists, and friends in every office. Every boardroom, every council chamber. They caught wind of what we were about to do. They would bury us under threats, lawsuits, and disinformation. But we had a plan. Single, audacious plan that relied on stealth, patience, and one key principle, timing. We chose to go public slowly, piece by piece. First, a few reporters who had never trusted OmniCorp journalists with teeth. Then, community leaders who might rally public outrage. Finally, the courthouse, the legal exposure that would be impossible to ignore. Every night, I went over the plan, memorizing every step, preparing for any contingency. My hands shook, but not from fear, they shook from anticipation. The folder wasn't just paper and print. It was the culmination of years of work, betrayal, and quiet rage. It was also a test of my own resolve. Could I stand by and watch Sterling's empire crumble, knowing that part of the town's livelihoods were tied to him? Could I tolerate the collateral damage, the inevitable chaos, for the sake of justice? I had no choice. The first public move came in the form of a small meeting with the town council. I didn't announce it widely. Too many ears could be listening. Only Alvaro and I entered the council chambers, files in hand. The room smelled of old wood and damp carpets, familiar in a way that brought a pang of nostalgia. I began to speak, my voice soft at first, almost tentative. I worked for OmniCorp for over 20 years. I designed systems to monitor water safety. I trusted them to protect you, to protect your families. A few heads tilted, some council members frowning. I opened the folder slowly, carefully, placing pages on the desk one by one. Server logs, emails, contamination maps. "This," I said, voice steady, "is the truth they hid from you." Every number, every memo, every reading was altered to make the water look safe. But it isn't safe. Our children, our neighbors, they're being poisoned silently, every day. A gasp echoed through the chamber. Murmurs grew. Councilwoman leaned forward, eyes wide, fingers trembling over her notepad. This can't be real," she whispered. I looked each of them in the eye. "It is real, and it will remain real until we act." Alvaro stepped in then, supporting the narrative, adding context, connecting the dots. Together, we laid out the scope of the corruption, the pattern of deceit, the hidden threats. By the time we finished, the chamber was silent, as if the weight of the truth had pressed down on every chair, every shoulder. That night, as I returned home, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. We had taken the first step, but the road ahead was perilous. OmniCorp would retaliate, Sterling would manipulate, and the town might fracture under the shock. But for the first time in years, I felt hope, the kind of hope that burns quietly before it ignites into action. Then came the first retaliation. The next morning, my mailbox contained a single envelope stamped with OmniCorp seal. Inside a letter, typed and cold. "Cease your actions immediately. Failure to comply will result in criminal prosecution. You have been warned." I laughed quietly, setting it down. The folder on my desk seemed heavier than ever, as if it too were laughing. Threats had no power over facts, over truth. But the town began to notice something else. Small, tangible signs of change. Parents started attending community meetings, asking questions. Teachers reported increasing absenteeism due to illness. Even the local paper, which had once ignored me, began sniffing at inconsistencies in OmniCorp's public reports. Our first ripple of public awareness had been centanned. It was spreading faster than I expected. I started keeping a journal, recording everything. Meetings, letters, conversations, subtle threats. I realized then that this was no longer just about me. It was about history, accountability, and the possibility that a single voice, frail, old, underestimated, could stand against a machine that believed itself invincible. Alvaro became my anchor. His cynicism had been replaced by determination, a reflection of my own. "They can't ignore this forever," he said one evening, reviewing the files. "Once the press picks it up, the courtroom will follow." "Yes," I whispered, staring at the glowing screen. "And once the truth comes out, no one will ever forget it." Weeks passed, and our exposure grew. Small leaks, community pressure, journalists asking hard questions. OmniCorp tried to spin, to deny, to threaten, but the folder had teeth. Each time, Sterling denied. Each time he smiled for cameras. I pictured the folder lying quietly in my hands, ready to roar. And then came the moment I knew the tide had turned. It wasn't in a court. Not yet. It was in the town square, during a water safety briefing. OmniCorp officials stood at a podium, smiling, pretending confidence. The mayor thanked them. The press clicked away. Then I stepped forward, folder in hand. Heart pounding, leg shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was about to do. "People of Grayridge," I said, voice ringing across the square. "You've been lied to. Every glass of water you've drunk, every report you've trusted has been manipulated. OmniCorp CEO Mr. Sterling has betrayed us all, and I have the proof." Murmurs turned to shouts. Phones rose, cameras zoomed. The officials froze, eyes widening. Sterling himself appeared behind them, face unreadable, mask slipping just enough for fear to glint. I opened the folder, letting the pages flutter in the breeze like a small storm. Every document, every memo, every corrupt reading was visible. The press leaned in, capturing it all. The people stared, disbelief and outrage battling on their faces. In that moment, I realized something. This was no longer just about revenge. This was about reclaiming dignity, health, and the trust that had been stolen. And as the crowd erupted, Sterling's calm, assured posture finally cracked. Justice, long delayed, was beginning to breathe. The day OmniCorp's lawyers first arrived at my door, I knew the storm had begun. They came not with sirens or violence, but with letters, summons, and threats dressed in legal jargon. "Cease and desist," one read. "Allegations of misconduct will be met with full litigation." They painted me as a disgruntled former employee, a meddling widow trying to poison a corporate reputation. I read each letter carefully, stacked them neatly, then placed them in a box labeled evidence. Alvaro glanced over my shoulder and said, "They're trying to intimidate you. They want fear to replace courage." I smiled quietly. "Then they've underestimated one thing." "What's that?" he asked. "Truth and stubbornness." Legal battles began almost immediately. OmniCorp filed motions to prevent me from releasing the documents publicly, claiming intellectual property theft and slander. Their lawyers were young, sharp, and confident, each one seeming like a miniature Sterling, arrogant, smooth, untouchable. But I had something they couldn't touch: absolute proof. Every memo, every server log, every falsified report traced back to Sterling himself. We spent nights preparing, cross-referencing data, rehearsing arguments, anticipating every loophole they might exploit. Alvaro worked tirelessly, sometimes until his hands shook. I stayed at his side, reviewing documents, watching the law become a weapon as much as it was a shield. Together, we created a fortress built not of steel, but of undeniable truth. Despite our preparation, the fight was brutal. OmniCorp's attorneys twisted words, questioned the authenticity of documents, accused me of fabricating evidence. I sat in the courtroom watching their confident smirks, feeling a familiar tremor of fear, but this time, I didn't let it take me. I had prepared for their every move. I had the town's truth on my side. And then came the first major breakthrough. During a deposition, one of Sterling's senior engineers, a man named Clifford Hayes, cracked. He stumbled over questions about system overrides, misrepresented data, and suspicious protocols. At first, he denied everything, repeating the rehearsed company line. But Alvaro was relentless. He presented the internal logs, the memos, the precise chain of commands. Clifford's confidence began to crumble. His voice shook. He glanced nervously at Sterling, who sat silent, jaw tight. Finally, Clifford whispered under his breath, "It's all true. It's all real." The words hung in the room like a gunshot. Silence pressed against every wall. OmniCorp's lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. Sterling's eyes narrowed, the mask slipping as panic threatened to show through. I felt a shiver of vindication. The walls of deceit were beginning to crack, but the retaliation was swift. Overnight, I discovered my mailbox flooded with threats, anonymous calls warning me to stop, packages containing nothing but dirt and ashes, even a note with a burned photograph of my home. The intimidation escalated, but each act only hardened my resolve. I realized Sterling had underestimated me, not just as a former employee, but as a woman who had endured grief, betrayal, and isolation and emerged stronger. The town, meanwhile, began to stir. Parents who had once feared me now sought me out, asking questions about the water, about what I had discovered. Teachers and nurses whispered behind closed doors, sharing observations, growing bold enough to attend council meetings. My quiet campaign was gaining momentum, and the community's pressure began to weigh on Sterling and his executives. One evening, I met with Alvaro in a dimly lit diner. The jukebox hummed in the background, but our conversation was all business. "They're panicking," he said, eyes sharp. "You've put them in a position they can't control. Sterling can spin lies, but he can't argue against irrefutable evidence." "I know," I replied, stirring my coffee. "And soon, the city will see the truth. Not just the council, not just the lawyers, but everyone." "And the fallout?" he asked cautiously. "You understand this could ruin lives, employees, the town economy, everything?" I sighed. I thought about that every night. But what's the point of safety, of jobs, if they're built on lies and poison? It's a hard choice, but the right one. Days later, we executed the next step, a controlled leak to the press. Carefully selected journalists received portions of the files, enough to expose corruption without compromising sensitive information about the town's immediate safety. The response was electric. Headlines screamed, "OmniCorp accused of poisoning town water." Proof emerges. Citizens flooded social media with questions and outrage. Sterling, once untouchable, was forced to appear on live television, fumbling explanations, evading direct questions, his polished veneer cracking with every skeptical reporter's probe. I watched it from my small apartment, the folders still by my side. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer exhilaration of seeing justice begin to take shape. The whispers I had once feared were now loud cries for accountability. The town's voice had found me, and through me, found courage. OmniCorp's response was predictable and terrifying. Lawsuits, defamation claims, and internal audits were launched with furious speed. They tried to discredit me publicly, painting me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. They bribed local officials, pressured the press, even attempted to buy Alvaro off. But with every attack, their desperation became more visible. Each lie they told only revealed the depth of their guilt. The legal battle grew more intense. Courtroom hours stretched endlessly. Sterling's face, once calm and untouchable, grew weary, lines deepening with the strain of exposure. Each time I stepped into the courtroom, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt since Tom died. Righteous fury tempered by careful strategy. I was not only fighting for myself, I was fighting for Grayridge, for the children who deserved safe water, for a town betrayed by the very people it trusted. Then came the turning point. A surprise witness emerged, a former OmniCorp executive who had been quietly compiling evidence for months, afraid to act under Sterling's reign. When she took the stand, she corroborated every claim I had made. Her testimony, coupled with the documents I had meticulously gathered, left the courtroom stunned. Even Sterling's legal team faltered, unable to reconcile the weight of evidence against them. In that moment, I felt a quiet vindication wash over me. The folder, once a burden, had become a weapon of truth. The years of fear, of isolation, of quiet tears and silent rage were finally paying off. The walls Sterling had built around his lies were collapsing, brick by brick, under the weight of proof, persistence, and the unwavering determination of one old woman who refused to be silenced. Outside the courthouse, Grayridge began to stir. People spoke openly about what had been happening, about the lies they had been told, about the water they drank without knowing the danger beneath. Parents held their children closer, teachers whispered warnings, and the press covered every detail. Sterling's empire, once polished and untouchable, trembled under the pressure of truth. I knew the fight wasn't over. There would be appeals, corporate smears, and threats. But for the first time, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in decades. Hope. Hope that justice, slow and deliberate, could finally reach the people who deserved it. Hope that the town could heal, and Sterling could no longer hide behind wealth and power. And hope that, in the quiet aftermath, I could finally exhale, knowing I had stood against a giant and survived. The morning the indictments were announced, Grayridge awoke to a city that felt unsteady, as if the very ground had shifted beneath its feet. OmniCorp's headquarters, once a gleaming symbol of pride, was now swarmed with reporters, cameras, and the quiet hum of legal engines grinding forward. The walls Sterling had built so meticulously around himself were collapsing, and the air smelled of inevitability like the moment just before a storm breaks. I sat at my kitchen table, folder open, hands tracing the pages I had carried for months. Alvaro's voice came over the phone, steady but tinged with awe. They've officially been indicted. Sterling's facing criminal charges for falsifying public safety records, endangering lives, and obstruction of justice. I exhaled slowly, feeling decades of tension seep out of me in a single shivering breath. Finally, justice was moving in the right direction. But Sterling, predictably, wasn't finished. Even under indictment, he tried to rally his executives, to spin narratives, to manipulate public perception. He gave interviews, smiling for cameras, claiming that OmniCorp had always acted in good faith, and that the allegations were misunderstandings blown out of proportion. His words were hollow enough that the echo of them barely reached the press. The people had already seen the folder, the proof, the truth laid bare. It was during the trial itself that the full weight of his actions became undeniable. Witnesses testified, documents were presented, and every lie he had told to cover up the poisoned water was exposed, meticulously traced back to his office. I sat in the courtroom, hands folded, heart tight, as families of the affected children told their stories of illness, anxiety, and betrayal. The sound of their voices, raw and trembling, pierced me deeper than any threat or insult ever had. At one point, Sterling's defense tried a desperate tactic, discrediting me, portraying my evidence as tampered, suggesting I had acted out of vengeance, jealousy, or bitterness. I didn't flinch. Alvaro stood firm, presenting the chain of custody, logs, timestamps, and internal memos. Every claim, every denial, every smirk from Sterling was dismantled in real time. The courtroom watched, rapt and silent. Then came the moment that changed everything. Sterling was forced to testify. He sat across from me, a man once towering and untouchable, now slumped in his chair. The suit that had always been his armor hanging slightly loose, eyes darting under the relentless gaze of the judge. He tried his usual charm, tried to lecture, tried to excuse. But the evidence, irrefutable and merciless, was a flood against his dam. Every lie crumbled. Every justification sounded hollow. I remember leaning forward, hands gripping the folder, watching as the arrogance in his posture drained away. I saw something I hadn't expected. Fear, pure, sharp, undeniable fear. Not for himself, he had enough money to escape almost anything but fear of exposure. Of the truth finally taking root in the lives he had poisoned. The court reporter's pen scratched furiously. Cameras captured every flinch, and the public watched in stunned silence. Sterling's empire, built on deception, was unraveling before him. Outside the courthouse, the town had gathered. Parents, teachers, friends, neighbors, they all waited, some holding children by the hand, others with tears glistening in their eyes. When the judge announced that Sterling would face sentencing for multiple counts of endangering public health, the air erupted with quiet relief. People cried, hugged, whispered thanks. I couldn't hear over the roar of the city's awakening. It was poetic in its own way. Sterling had built his empire to impress, to dominate, to control. Yet here he was, powerless, exposed, stripped of pride and influence. His lies laid bare not in a boardroom or a press release, but in a courtroom that the people of Grayridge could witness firsthand. Alvaro squeezed my shoulder as we left the courthouse. "You did this," he said, voice thick. "You made them accountable." I shook my head, a small, sad smile touching my lips. "We did this. All of us. The town, the truth, and yes, me too." Sterling didn't fight his fate gracefully. He tried at first, with legal maneuvers, delaying tactics, and public statements. But every attempt faltered. His former allies, once loyal, abandoned him. Investors pulled out. Public opinion turned like a tide, relentless and unstoppable. The very water he had poisoned became a symbol of his reckoning, a reminder that every action has consequences. And then came the poetic justice I had imagined for years. OmniCorp's public image, carefully curated for decades, collapsed like a house of cards. Sterling was forced to issue a public apology scripted, yes, but humiliating nonetheless. The apology was broadcast on every channel, read aloud in the courtroom, printed in newspapers, and circulated online. Every citizen who had trusted him could finally see the man behind the mask. Not a visionary leader, but a liar and a coward. I didn't celebrate, not loudly at least. I didn't dance or shout. I simply sat by the river that night, folder in hand, the water reflecting the streetlights like tiny truths scattered across its surface. The river was still, but I knew that beneath, currents had shifted. Grayridge would heal slowly, but it would heal honestly. I thought of Tom, of Maya, of the children whose lives had been endangered. I thought of every sleepless night I had endured, every fear, every whisper of doubt. And for the first time in decades, I felt peace. Not triumph, not revenge, but peace. The quiet satisfaction that comes from standing for what is right, even when the odds are crushing. Sterling's fall was complete. Its empire would rebuild. Yes, but under the scrutiny of law, conscience, and a town that now knew the truth. His wealth could not erase the legacy of deceit, nor the moral consequences of his actions. I returned home that night and placed the folder in a locked cabinet. Its work was done. Its pages had spoken louder than any speech I could give, louder than any protest, louder than any plea I had ever made. It was proof. It was vindication. It was justice. And as I sat by the window listening to the quiet hum of Grayridge at night, I realized something profound. Revenge is not about cruelty. Revenge is about balance. It is about tipping the scales back toward truth, toward morality, toward a sense of order that cannot be bought or intimidated. I had stood against a giant. I had faced threats, fear, and isolation. I had fought not just for myself, but for an entire town, for children whose innocence had been endangered, for a husband whose faith and decency had been betrayed. And now, finally, the scales were tipping. The city outside whispered with the hum of normalcy, but I knew the undercurrents had shifted forever. Grayridge was stronger, wiser, and awake. OmniCorp had learned finally that deceit cannot last forever. And I had learned that age alone is no measure of strength. Courage, persistence, and truth are. The reckoning was complete. Sterling would face the consequences of every lie. The town would remember the name Alina Ward not as a meddler or a disgruntled employee, but as the woman who refused to let a giant hide behind his lies. And I, at 74, finally allowed myself to breathe. After the courtroom victories and public revelations, most people assumed the story had ended. Sterling was humbled, OmniCorp's reputation in ruins, and Grayridge slowly recovering. But for me, the revenge was never about headlines or applause. It was about the small, deliberate acts that whispered the truth to those who had doubted, that reminded the powerful that they were never untouchable. I began with Sterling's office. Not with rage, not with a mob, but quietly, meticulously, through contacts I had cultivated over the years, engineers, cleaners, assistants, small pieces of truth were circulated within the walls he had relied on. Leaked memos, subtle reminders of accountability, reports of internal failures. Nothing that would destroy anyone legally, but enough to haunt those who had enabled the corruption. I wanted them to feel the unease of complicity, the weight of the truth they had ignored. Then there were the symbolic acts. I made sure that the community had access to the real water safety reports, printed and distributed anonymously. Schools received clean, accurate data to ensure children were protected. Local journalists received documents confirming what I had already presented publicly, reinforcing that the truth could not be ignored. Every act was small, deliberate, and meaningful ripples in a pond that had once been poisoned. One evening, I walked past OmniCorp's headquarters. Sterling was inside, likely reviewing legal bills, damage control strategies, and press releases. He saw me from a distance, and for a moment, his eyes widened, not with fear, but with recognition. He knew I was the force that had toppled his illusions. I didn't wave, didn't speak. I simply walked past, folder in hand, a quiet reminder that the battle had been fought and lost. The town itself had begun to reclaim its dignity. Parents no longer hesitated to ask questions. Teachers confidently shared accurate health advice, and the local newspaper ran a series of investigative articles praising the resilience of Grayridge's citizens. Every time I walked down the streets, I saw subtle signs of change. Families drinking safely from public fountains, children laughing near the river without fear, neighbors discussing solutions instead of passing blame. Each small victory was a quiet revenge against the fear and silence Sterling had cultivated. There were moments, of course, when the temptation to confront Sterling directly tugged at me. I imagined standing in front of him, face to face, recounting every betrayal, every poisoned report, every sleepless night spent worrying about the children of Grayridge. But I knew that real power lay in subtlety. Justice didn't need theatrics, it needed endurance. I had spent decades building credibility, trust, and knowledge. Sterling's empire had depended on arrogance and charm. By quietly dismantling his foundation, I achieved a revenge far more satisfying than any confrontation could provide. I also began to reconcile with myself. For years, the anger had burned quietly, a constant companion to grief and betrayal. Now, I allowed myself to feel satisfaction, not vengeance for its own sake, but relief, closure, and the knowledge that every action had been deliberate, just, and necessary. I realized that the quiet acts of justice, the careful planning, the unwavering resolve had become part of who I was. I wasn't just a woman wronged, I was a guardian of truth. One night I received a letter in the mail. It was unsigned, but unmistakable. Inside was a note. "You were right. Thank you for not letting us down." I smiled, recognizing the handwriting immediately. It was from a former colleague who had witnessed the corruption but feared speaking out until the evidence was undeniable. He, too, had been quietly instrumental in the town's awakening. The note was small, but it was the kind of validation that resonates deeper than public acclaim. It reminded me that revenge is never solitary. It echoes through the lives it touches, correcting wrongs one life at a time. The quiet revenge also allowed me to reflect on Sterling's personal downfall. I knew he had wealth, connections, and resources, but none of it could shield him from exposure, humiliation, and accountability. Friends who had once smiled at him in boardrooms now avoided eye contact. Investors who had praised his vision now questioned every decision. I imagined the gnawing anxiety he felt every morning, waking to a world in which his power no longer guaranteed control. Justice, I realized, didn't always roar, sometimes whispered patiently, in ways that lingered far longer than any public spectacle. I continued to live my days carefully, purposefully. I returned to the river that had once reflected the poisoned waters of Grayridge. Now it shimmered cleanly, and I could see children playing along the banks without fear. The sight was more powerful than any courtroom victory, more satisfying than any headline. It was proof that small acts, deliberate and just, could ripple outward and correct even the most insidious wrongs. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch, a young journalist approached. She had covered the trial extensively and wanted to ask a few questions about my motivations. I told her simply, I wanted what was right, not what was easy. Truth has weight and it demands attention. If you carry it forward carefully, it can protect lives, inspire courage, and remind the powerful that their actions are never invisible. She nodded, eyes wide, taking notes with a seriousness that reminded me of my younger self. Perhaps, I thought, this was part of the legacy, the courage to stand quietly, persistently against giants, even when no one is watching. In the evenings, I often returned to the folder, placing it on my desk, occasionally flipping through its pages. It was no longer a burden, it was a testament that ordinary people, even those overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed, could wield justice with patience, intelligence, and moral clarity. Every page represented not just the exposure of Sterling's crimes, but the restoration of dignity to a town that had been silenced by fear. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I allowed myself to feel a deep, simmering satisfaction. Not the vindictive thrill of watching someone fall, but the quiet joy of seeing balance restored. Sterling had been powerful, untouchable, and arrogant. Yet, in the end, the truth, my determination, and the town's courage had triumphed. Grayridge would remember the damage he caused, yes. But it would also remember the resilience that stood in opposition, resilience that quietly but decisively ensured that no lie could ever take root again. In that sense, revenge was not about cruelty. It was about restoring equilibrium, correcting what had been broken, and reminding the world that accountability waits patiently for the moment when it can no longer be ignored. And in the quiet of my home, listening to the river and the faint hum of the town, I felt that equilibrium settling. The folder rested in its locked cabinet, a quiet monument to justice, proof that careful, deliberate action could bring even the most arrogant down to the level of truth. I knew that Sterling's empire might continue in some form, that his wealth might endure, but nothing could erase the exposure, the accountability, and the lessons he had learned too late. He had been a giant, yes, but even giants fall when confronted by patience, courage, and the unassailable force of truth. And Elena Ward finally felt free. The first morning I woke after the trial's conclusion, Grayridge felt different. It wasn't louder or flashier. The streets weren't suddenly crowded with celebrations or media crews. It was quieter, steadier, as if the town itself had taken a deep collective breath. Life went on, yes, but now with a subtle weight lifted the knowledge that truth had prevailed. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, steam curling upward in the soft sunlight. In my hand rested the folder, now carefully labeled, locked, and archived. I no longer needed to open it. Its purpose had been fulfilled. The proof that Sterling's deceit had endangered an entire community had served its role. The exposure, the reckoning, the quiet revenge. Now it was history, a testament to the power of truth and perseverance. I reflected on the long path that had brought me here. The grief of losing Tom, the betrayal by someone I once trusted implicitly, the sleepless nights reviewing data, the fear of threats, the courage required to face a man as powerful as Sterling, it all converged into the person I had become. I was no longer just a widow or a former IT analyst. I had become a guardian of justice, a voice for the voiceless. A reminder that age does not diminish one's ability to fight. There were moments of quiet satisfaction. Of course. Sterling had lost more than reputation. He had lost the illusion of control, the arrogance of untouchability. He would never again walk through Grayridge without the shadow of accountability following him. A constant reminder that lies, no matter how carefully constructed, can never escape scrutiny forever. Yet I found that I did not dwell on his fall with malice. The satisfaction was quieter, richer on appreciation of balance restored rather than joy in someone suffering. Grayridge, too, was healing. Parents now spoke freely at school board meetings. Teachers implemented real safety protocols, and local journalists continued to hold power accountable. Conversations that once skirted around fear now addressed reality, action, and responsibility. Walking through the town, I noticed the subtle changes. Fresh flowers along the riverbank, children laughing without worry, neighbors greeting one another openly. The water itself, once a source of fear, now flowed clean, a symbol of renewal and vigilance. Even in the quiet moments, I could feel the echo of what had been accomplished. The folder, my work, and the courage it took to stand against Sterling were more than personal victories. They were proof that one person's persistence can ripple outward, influencing an entire community. The power of truth is patient, subtle, relentless. I had seen it in action, and it had changed lives forever. I allowed myself to reflect on what I had learned about human nature: trust, betrayal, fear, and hope. These threads had woven through every interaction, every confrontation, every sleepless night. I had learned that people, even those in power, are vulnerable to the quiet, steadfast weight of truth. I had also learned that fear, while intimidating, is rarely as permanent as courage. Sterling had relied on fear to control, but courage had prevailed. There were letters, emails, and messages from the townspeople, from colleagues, even from strangers who had heard the story. Gratitude, awe, and admiration poured in. Some recounted how their children were now safe, how communities were reconnecting, how hope had returned. I read them slowly, savoring each word, knowing that the ripple of justice I had set in motion extended far beyond the courtroom or the press coverage. Every message was a small testament, a quiet celebration of accountability, a reminder that persistence matters. I thought often of Tom, my late husband, whose absence had shaped my path. I imagined him watching, smiling quietly, proud that the fight I had undertaken was not for ego or vengeance alone, but for the good of others. The justice achieved, the community awakened, and the balance restored felt like the completion of a promise to him, to myself, and to the town we had both loved. Sterling's consequences were final, though perhaps incomplete in some material sense. He retained wealth, yes, but no amount of money could buy back trust, restore innocence, or undo the exposure of wrongdoing. That was the beauty of poetic justice. It does not always need to destroy, only to restore. And in that restoration, balance is achieved, even if the world continues moving forward. I allowed myself small joys again. Quiet mornings by the river, walks through the sunlit streets of Grayridge. Conversations with neighbors untainted by fear or deceit. The peace was hard-won, but it was real. I no longer felt the constant tension of worry, the shadow of betrayal lurking in every corner. The town was awake, and so was I, fully alive in a life reclaimed from lies. There were evenings when I returned to the folder, flipping through the pages one last time. I did not read for evidence or confirmation. Those days were behind me. I read for memory, for reflection, for the weight of what had been accomplished. Every memo, every server log, every email represented more than deceit, represented a battle fought with patience, integrity, and unwavering courage. And then finally, I closed it for good. The last act of my personal justice had been carried out quietly, deliberately. Sterling had faced exposure and legal consequences. The town had reclaimed its safety and voice. And I had, in the process, found closure. Not vengeance in its raw form, but the profound satisfaction of balance restored, of wrongs addressed, of courage recognized. I realized something profound in that quiet moment. Justice is not always loud. It does not always demand spectacle. Often it is patient, subtle, and deliberate, rippling outward until it reaches those who need it most. And in those ripples, even the smallest actions carry weight beyond measure. Grayridge, once a town quietly suffering under the shadow of betrayal, now flourished in awareness and community. The water flowed clean, the children laughed freely, and the citizens carried a renewed sense of responsibility. And I, Alina Ward, sat quietly in the sun, knowing that courage, persistence, and truth had prevailed where fear and deception had once ruled. In the end, I understood that the story was never truly about Sterling or OmniCorp. It was about the resilience of ordinary people, the power of truth, and the quiet, deliberate acts that can change the course of a community. Revenge, when guided by justice and moral clarity, does not destroy, it restores. And as I watched the river shimmer beneath the afternoon sun, I felt complete. The fight was over. The town was safe. The truth had endured. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe freely, knowing that, at long last, the scales had been balanced. And as I walked home that night, the folder clutched tight against my chest. I made myself a promise: they would not win again.